Hello, thank you for joining us today for our sixth webinar in an 8-part series for the Berkley Master Plan. My name is Tori Mathis, and I am the Community Engagement Officer with the City of Berkley. With me today is Megan Menison-Minnock, Planner, Ben Carlisle, Principal Planner, and Chris Nordstrom, Landscape Architect from Carlisle-Wortman Associates. As you may know, we are updating the Berkley Master Plan from its current version, which was adopted in 2007. A lot has changed in Berkley and the world since then, so it's important to keep that guiding planning document current and reflective of the needs and the goals of the community. One of the most important components of updating a master plan document is getting the community member feedback. That includes business owners, property owners, residents, and more. Prior to the global pandemic, we had began a robust and extensive community engagement strategy to get the thoughts and opinions of all Berkley residents. This includes visiting all city boards and commissions, PTA groups, moms and dads clubs, visiting the Berkley High School and Oxford Towers, and setting up booths and activities at many of our events throughout the summer. Unfortunately, those engagement activities had been canceled, but we did not want to stop the forward momentum and wonderful feedback we were receiving from the community. So we had to think outside of the box and devise an entirely new community engagement strategy. This 8-part series will examine a new topic each session. For your convenience, these sessions are being recorded and are available on the YouTube channel, so you can refer back to them with your friends and family at your leisure. Thus far, we have tackled some hot-button topics such as parking, gathering spaces, stormwater, utilities, and green infrastructure. And today, we will be talking about our corridors along 11 Mile, 12 Mile, Coolidge, and Greenfield. This webinar will be led by a 3-person panel, including Megan and Chris and myself. Carlisle-Wortman has been able to retain and assist the City of Berkley with updating the master plan and leading these community engagement strategies and activities. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type out your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Or you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function after the presentation has concluded and ask your questions directly to one of our panelists. Without further ado, Megan.
I'm actually going to take the lead here, Tori. My name is Ben Carlisle with Carlisle-Wortman Associates. Again, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. With me as well is my colleague Megan Menison-Minnock. And we are extremely excited to be part of the Berkley master planning process, and it's a really exciting time for the community. As Tori noted, this is the 6th in a series of webinars that we're hosting to discuss various topics with regards to the master plan. I'd be remiss to not note that Erin, who's a community development director, who normally is the introduces these topics, is having surgery today. She fell on her ankle, so we're wishing her the best in a quick and speedy recovery. We certainly miss her. As I noted, this is the 6th in a series of webinars. The other 5 can be found on the city's YouTube page. We encourage you to go back and look at those if you haven't seen them already. So again, this will be a short presentation, 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll follow up with your questions. You may write the questions as I'm presenting, and we'll address them after the presentation. So as Tori noted, we're going to talk about corridors, and specifically the corridors of 11 Mile, 12 Mile, Greenfield, Coolidge, and Woodward. The corridors for Berkley serve a number of purposes. First, and perhaps foremost, they're a transportation thoroughfare. This obviously includes automobiles, but there's also use of bikes and buses and scooters and pedestrians that all use that corridor. As we've noted, 12 Mile is your downtown. It's also a corridor. And as such, that corridor, as long as others, do provide a number of uses, specifically commercial uses. These include retail, offices, and services. Some corridors include housing, including single-family housing and multifamily housing. And they also include institutional uses. In addition, these corridors also serve as a gateway in the community, and they're often the only thing a visitor sees as they enter and travel through Berkley. When you think about that, the corridors in terms of a visual appearance are very important because they are perhaps the only thing that visitors may see as they enter and move through your community. And lastly, they're a gathering place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are kind of the central areas that the city gathers outside of your parks. So this map is your existing land use map, and the predominant color is that light yellow color. That's single family residential. But if you actually look along the corridors of 12 and 11 Mile and Coolidge and Woodward, you actually see a varied mix of colors. Those varied colors represent the varied mix of land uses on your corridor. The light kind of, I would call it pink color, is commercial. So obviously you have predominantly a large and significant amount of commercial uses along your corridor. But if you actually go along 11 Mile, you'll see a lot of purple color. That's industrial. So this just shows and represents the varied land uses that you have along your corridor. The other corridor of Greenfield, as you can see all the way over here to the left, is predominantly single-family residential. So that's the corridor that we don't see much significant change as part of the master planning process. One of the things you'll hear us talk about is streets, and specifically people streets. And that may be a little bit different term than you may have heard before. And I think these pictures on the screen show a really interesting difference in picture of how a difference between streets. Both are from Traverse City. Some of you have probably been on both these streets. One is in downtown on Front Street, and the one below is on Division Street. The top picture is what we would constitute as a people street. And so what we might mean by that is the street you can see is fairly narrow. It's got no more than 2 lanes of traffic. It's got parking on both sides, and all of which means the cars have to drive slowly through this area. The sidewalks and bump outs and crosswalks and signals make it easier for people to cross the street and travel along the street. You can see there's a significant number of street trees, and those provide both a physical barrier from the road travel, but they also provide a significant amount of shade. You can see all the businesses have storefront windows, and they open into the street. So obviously they're very easily accessible from pedestrians passing by. And lastly, you can't really see it very well from this picture, but most of these buildings have a second and sometimes a third story. And this includes a mix of uses. So there's residential or retail on the first floor, an office on the first floor, and then above in the second floor could be more offices, or it could be residential. And this generates additional tax revenue with those second and third stories, as well as puts more people within walking distance to occupy these businesses. The lower photo is what we would constitute more as an automobile design street. So it's a very, very wide road. It's got multiple lanes of traffic. There is no on-street parking, and all of that encourages fast driving. You can see the sidewalks are rather uninviting. There's no physical separation other than the curb between the travel lane and the sidewalk. There's no trees. There's no landmarks or anything to kind of separate and designate that pedestrian area. What you'll see in this picture, there's no crosswalks. So it's very difficult to get from one side of the road to the other side of the road. You really have to go up to the street light, to the blocks to cross the street here. And lastly, as I noted, there's limited, I would say, no landscaping along the corridor. You don't see a single tree within the right of way for this picture. So what makes a great street, or what makes a great corridor? And I want you to take a second and think of your favorite street. So picture that street in your mind. I bet you when you think of your favorite street, you think of more of a people-oriented street, like the example I gave in Traverse City, than you maybe would have thought as an automobile-oriented street. And I bet you your favorite street includes a number of the elements I spoke about with what we constitute as a people-oriented street. These are not new, and it's nothing I made up or invented, but they really are tried and true and tested strategies that over a number of years that make these streets kind of more universal and inviting. So these great streets or corridors include a mix of uses. They include pedestrian, safety, and amenity features. They are a complete street. So what we mean by that is they're designed for all modes of travel: bicyclists, pedestrians, transit, and the automobile. They have an appropriate scale. So the building height to street width ratio is important. So basically what that means is you want the building heights to be equal or consistent with the width of the street. Ones that are a too wide street with lower buildings doesn't create an inviting space, but buildings having them too high with a narrow street also creates more of a canyon effect and also isn't uninviting. All or most great streets include some sort of park or a public space. It doesn't necessarily be a park, but a plaza or a public space to gather. And lastly, pedestrian design. Buildings are close to the street. Parking lots are typically in the back. There's on-street parking. and it creates a much more inviting pedestrian experience. With that in mind, I want to kind of share and highlight the results that we did. We did a survey for the community, and we received, I believe at this point, over 1,300 responses. One of the questions we asked was with regards to land use along the corridor. The most desired land use, or ones that people felt were most underserved on all the corridors except Greenfield, was more retail, more restaurants, and more entertainment venues. In addition, mixed use also was rated very high. Now, I'll note that the numbers for these all varied by the corridor, but with all of the corridors noted except for Greenfield, restaurant, retail, and entertainment uses always rated the highest on all the corridors. So this shows what people wanted on 12 Mile. And the current mix they felt was just too little. It's the dark blue color, was retail at 4%, restaurants at 57%, and entertainment at 56%. If you go down to the bottom of the table, you can see that mixed use also scored high at 35%. Now, this number is pretty consistent from on Coolidge. Again, 41% felt that there was too little retail, 66% too little restaurants, 50% entertainment, and 39% mixed use. Similar results on 11 Mile, 61% more retail, 71% restaurants, 48% entertainment, and 36% mixed use. And again, Woodward the same. Retail scored high, restaurants scored high, entertainment scored high, and mixed use scored high. In addition, we asked about what changes you'd like to see in Berkley. And people desired more shopping options, more recreational opportunities, and in addition, increased safety for pedestrians and more bicycle paths or bike lanes also scored high. So what that told us was a pretty interesting picture. Residents of Berkley clearly desire a mix of uses, and this is mostly restaurant, and retail, entertainment, but also mixed use scored very high. They desire walkability. They also want to gather in spaces and create interesting places, and that's what the placemaking concept is. And lastly, and we heard this very loud, is they want all this, but they don't want to become the next, and you can insert your surrounding community there. They don't want to become the next Royal Oak or Southfield, or again, insert community. So they want improvements on the corridors, they want a change of use on the corridors, they want walkability, but they don't want to become other said community. So as it relates to this community desire, obviously there's good and bad news, and that seems to be always the case. The good news is the bones are in place. You're way far ahead of the curve with your community, with your current community layout. You have essentially what most communities or many communities are desiring to either create or recreate. Literally, we are working with a number of communities that are simply literally trying to create what you have. You have an established grid street pattern and walkability connections. This makes walking and biking much more easier to get around and through the city. Your building placements pattern is already established. If you look at this picture above of Coolidge, you can see the buildings are placed right at the sidewalk. Parking is in the rear, so your established building pattern is already in place. With your density, you already have enough surrounding rooftops to support commercial and really build upon it. In many corridors, your streetscape elements are already in place. For example, look at what you have here on Coolidge. You have got flowers, you've got trees, you've got on-street parking, you've got benches, you've got decorative street lighting. So many of the elements of streetscape are already in place. And perhaps most importantly, there's a strong community desire. And that's the one thing that we can't overcome as planners is if there's not a desire for it, we can't help you build it. But there is a strong desire for it, and so we really want to leverage and build on that as we look forward. So that's the good news. Now here is a little bit of the bad news. On many of the corridors, there's some real strong missing elements. And I'm not going to pick on 12 Mile, but I guess I will, because the missing elements that I talk about can all be seen as an example on 12 Mile. So first, looking at it, 12 Mile clearly is an automobile-oriented street. It's got 2 lanes of traffic in both ways. There's no bike lane. There's little protection from the sidewalk, from the travel lane. And as you can see, There's limited pedestrian, mid-block or pedestrian street crossings. Again, you have to walk to the light to cross the street. I just ask, when you look at this, is this a place where you want to walk down the road? Is it inviting? Is it a place that you want to bike down the road? So all these elements of the pedestrian people-oriented street clearly are not always reflected on 12 Mile here. The other significant issue, again, about creating more people-oriented street is your existing parcel dimensions. Most of the parcels in the corridor are very narrow and limited with depth. We often call these bowling alley lots because they're simply long and skinny. This is not unique to Berkeley, and we often find this in many communities that surround or like Berkeley. So when these corridors were platted, simply the conditions were different. Automobile wasn't dominant at that point, and the development pressures were simply different. So if you look at this example, look at the parcel in the lower right-hand corner. It's pretty standard, typical lot on a corridor. It's 100 feet deep, and depending on this, either 20 to 40 feet wide. So if you take that area, you take that lot area, you simply have an area of about 2,000 to 4,000 square feet. There are houses that are bigger in Berkeley than the 4,000 square feet. So you take that 4,000 square feet or 2,000 square feet, and on top of that, you have to provide parking. So the average parking space is about 180 square feet. So simply to install 10 parking spaces to serve this business, you would be required to allocate approximately 1,800 square feet of that total lot. So depending on the size of the lot, that would either be the entire lot or it would be half the lot. That area of 1,800 square feet doesn't include alleys and drive aisles and buffering or anything that takes up lot area. So essentially, just because of the size limitation, coupled with the requirement to provide off-street parking, development on many of these lots simply is not feasible. In fact, may be impossible, especially with anything of any significance. Now take the parcel on the left. You see it's got 340 feet of depth. It's got 200 feet of width. There's a lot of room to play with in terms of putting parking in there, building more significance of building, putting the appropriate buffer and transition. The difficulty is you've got this established building pattern of these 100-foot deep lots that are very difficult to build, and it's much more. These 100-foot lots are much more prevalent than these much deeper lots that I showed on this slide. So the other thing's lacking from 12 Miles gathering space. And you've heard, or you will hear us talk about this concept of placemaking. So that may not be a common term for you, but essentially what it is, it's the concept of creating public spaces that are multifunctional, they're interesting, they're visually appealing, and they can be used by multiple generations. And so the downtown plan that was adopted noted a need for placemaking in a common gathering space. This graphic from the plan that was as part of your part of your downtown plan shows a pretty easy and creative way to create a multi-purpose area without much capital costs or infrastructure. And more communities are using these creative techniques such as this to create these multi-functional spaces. It doesn't take a huge investment. This really is not a huge significant investment from a capital cost standpoint. But it does take creativity, and it does take buy-in from the community to accept the transformation such as shown in this picture. So we're going to go back to our 3 what method. So the first what? Well, what? There is a community desire for improvements to the corridor. That's obvious. The so what is, so the bones are in place, but there are some significant limitations. So what our job is to help the community is, now what? What do we do about that? Well, there are a few strategies that are clearly easier to implement than others. So the city on their own or with the DDA or with some other form of public-private partnership could implement a streetscape program along either select corridors or sections of the corridors. This doesn't need to be applied on every single length of 12 Mile, but maybe we highlight certain sections that it should be. The streetscaping could include landscaping, decorative paving, seating, lighting, etc. And frankly, the streetscaping is a rather minimal investment that really goes a long way to transform a corridor. In addition, the city could create a community gathering and flex space. The use of Rabina, shown in that next to the Berkley Theater, is a great example of that. Again, it does not require a huge significant investment on behalf of the city to put that in place. And lastly, the encouragement of a mix of uses, including residential, strongly boast corridor improvement. The residential uses would bring a 24-hour 7 feel to the corridor and add rooftops that support the commercial in the corridor. So those are the easy strategies. The more difficult ones include formulating strategies around parcel size issue and traffic calming. And I'm just going to kind of highlight those two very quickly. So one thing you'll hear me say a lot, and I've heard from other people in other places, is we're not creating more land in Berkeley. You're a built-out community. We just can't simply create land. So how do you get more intensity, mix of uses, restaurants, retail? Well, you either go up or you go back, or you go wide and encourage lot consolidation. So lot consolidation is a strategy where you put two of those 40-foot lots together and you make an 80-foot lot or a 160-foot wide lot. It is difficult because you have to have multiple owners buy in, or you have to buy out multiple owners to make that happen. Address the depth or parking issues, but what it does give you is just simply more land to do a little more things with. However, that may not address all of your issues. One of the other strategy is to allow the corridor to go deeper. So what that simply means is planning not just for the lot that fronts on the corridor, but plan for a lot or two or three or potentially block deeper off the corridor. Obviously, there are some issues with that, and it needs to be thought out. One of the issues is that now we will be master planning for single-family residential. Essentially, we'll be assigned a different land use to existing single-family uses, and there's some concern with that, obviously. In addition, there would need to be a strong consideration between the transition between any single-family and any more intensity on the corridor. And this transition includes issues of height and setback, but also uses, landscaping, screening, etc. Another strategy that we've talked about, and we went much more in depth with regards with this, was in the parking webinar, was simply just we need to rethink parking. This could include either eliminating off-street parking requirements in certain areas or address parking in other creative ways, which went to much more depth with the previous webinar. Another more difficult option to discuss would be traffic calming. And this may include on-street parking, road diets, pedestrian crossings. The city's already undertaken this. I know the pilot program of traffic calming measures have been undertaken on Coolidge, and my understanding is they've been met with mixed results. I've heard positive and negative on all sides of that pilot program. And while I don't claim to be an expert in traffic calming or traffic engineering by any means, there is ample evidence that suggests that traffic calming does convert a road from an automobile-oriented road I showed in the previous slides to more of a people road that you'll see in Traverse City in some examples. I discussed some pretty significant strategies that require some significant discussions. To be honest, some of these concepts will not work on all the corridors. For example, Greenfield is predominantly single family, and we are master planning it to stay that way. In addition, I'm not sure if a road diet on 11 Mile is really appropriate. However, with that being said, it is going to be very difficult, not impossible, but difficult to achieve the desired results that would indicate in the survey without what I would say rethinking their corridors. Should the corridors remain auto-oriented simply to get cars through as quick as possible as they're currently designed, especially on 12 Mile? Or do we want to think of these corridors more as people-oriented streets that strike that balance between getting cars through, but also allowing for multi-modes of transportation and a greater sense of place, as well as more pedestrian improvements? Should we plan to add what I would call depth to the corridor by talking about those parcels adjacent to it? And lastly, I think we need to have a real strong community conversation on rethinking parking, especially as a fundamental driver of redevelopment. Current parking standards are as written and based on the parcel issues, really can be a detriment to redeveloping any of these parcels on the corridor. With that being said, there is no magic bullet. Any significant changes will require community discussion and decisions. And there is a give and take to all of this. The balancing of the streets is, there's a balance between getting cars through and allowing it for more of a people-oriented place. So there is give and take on all of these sides. So I just want to be very clear that we are realistic to that fact. So just real quick before we get to the questions, we have 2 more upcoming webinars. The next is on housing. It's going to be on June 24th at 6. And then lastly, we're going to go over some draft vision goals and objectives. That's going to be on June 30th. Thursday, we have a drop-in to discuss the corridor issues that I just talked about, and the information for that is on this slide. And lastly, we want to hear from you. All the webinars we posted, so please comment. There's a Facebook group, the Master Plan Community Group. As well, if you don't feel comfortable sharing your thoughts publicly, you can always email us at the email address at masterplan@berkleymich.net, or you can always mail us suggestions, or you can often leave a voicemail, and all the information on the slide. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and we are looking for some robust discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So we have some attendees, and you're more than welcome to raise your hand, and we would unmute your mic, or share a question or comment in the Q&A. But just to kick us off, Ben, what do you think are the ways to properly buffer those single-family homes that would abut commercial uses on the corridor, either if existing or if that expansion of depth was planned for?
Yeah, it's you know, Megan, it's that's almost one of the last things we need to think about. And what I mean by that is our strategy for that buffer and that transition really is dependent on what strategy we tackle first. So if we tackle parking, it's a different strategy with how we buffer it if we tackle lot depth or lot width. So what I mean by that is if we eliminate the need to do on-site off-street parking for residential areas, for redevelopment of these corridors, that what would constitute as parking area before could now be used as landscape buffer, setback buffer, some different techniques that we can use. If we don't implement that, it's much harder. You have, again, very limited amount of area, much harder to put in those proper buffers, etc. If one of the strategies is to go deeper and add more parcel depth to this, that also gives us a lot more area to provide the necessary buffers in terms of, again, landscaping, setbacks, etc. The other strategy is if we allow properties to go a little bit higher, is maybe the section of the building that's closest to street could be an additional story, but those that are closer to residential drop down in height, so there's some buffering. So the issue of buffering with residential really is a multifaceted strategy that would be really the last thing we would not the last thing, but it would really be dependent upon what we do as the strategies to address other issues in the corridor.
So what's the first thing to think about?
Well, I think the first thing to think about is the easy ones. The corridors, the streetscape, the gathering spaces. Again, not a huge significant investment on behalf of the community. It doesn't require much infrastructure improvements. It doesn't require us to acquire new property. It's something that we can do within the existing framework of the corridors. The next thing we should do is we really need to have a community conversation about these issues that I raised, the ones of traffic calming and the parcel limitations. And the reason for that is the only way that a lot of that gets implemented is through zoning. And we need to lay the framework for the potential zoning changes in the master plan. And so we really need to have that community conversation about whether or not this is something the community would like to see us move forward on, because we can't implement these changes until the community has this discussion.
Thanks. We had a question from Chris C. What are the plans for increasing the visibility of transit stops along the corridor and making them more attractive to users?
Do you want to tackle that one, or I can tackle it?
Why don't you tackle it first, and I'll
sure.
fill in after.
So the downtown DDA plan showed a number of good examples of enhanced transit stops. In some communities they call them super stops, some they call them enhanced transit stops. So they include everything from better sheltering, so a much more enclosed area where people can wait, and it's much more visible to be seen. Includes improvements with lighting in that area, so it feels safer. for people. It includes better access. There's better pedestrian access to get. So, for example, maybe there should be a street crossing close to it to allow people to get to that shelter easily. It includes real-time service updates, so you know exactly when your next bus is coming. It may include pull-offs or bump-outs where you actually allow buses to pull off to allow for safer loading and unloading. It includes timing of the signals to allow for buses to move quicker through the signals than normal traffic. Those are all considerations, and they were listed in the DDA plan. This, though, has to be done in partnership with both the road commission for those roads that are road commission roads, and most importantly, SMART, because obviously it's their investment with regards to these objectives. But those are kind of the more easier ways to increase transit viability along the corridors.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that often the transit authorities are concerned about maintenance of the lighting and the shelters long term. So if there's something that the community can offer for them taking over part of that, or adopt a stop, or if we're going to take care of the lighting that's nearby, things like that, those often help with getting those improvements bumped up the list because they're looking at it as system wide.
Yeah, and what we've done in a lot of our communities is we've made the development community partners in a lot of these improvements. So, for example, if they're redeveloping a certain building, we require them to put in the streetscape in front of their building, or we require them to put in or assist with a better bus shelter or something like that. So, our experience has been if there's a very healthy public-private partnership, it's a lot easier to get this done than if it's something simply the city takes on. And we found that most of the development community and other partners really are willing to be partners in this if it's beneficial to all parties.
Chris had another question. Do the proposals include higher volume bicycle parking options at the stops?
Yes, Chris, I believe so. And if they don't, that's something that's pretty easily able to be put in and installed. So yes, the short answer is yes.
Ben, wouldn't you agree that bicycle parking can be part of that overall parking conversation as well?
Yep.
In the focus groups that I've been hosting in the last week, bicycle parking and not having a place to park for events with bikes has come up, and maybe that's something that should be looked at. It's just, something that should be part of any corridor.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways to not to turn this back into a parking discussion, which we do a lot, but there's a lot of ways to think of parking. One is a supply issue. It's simply, are you supplying enough parking in the right spots? One also is a demand. How can you reduce the demand for automobile parking? Well, part of that is in providing other means of transportation, such as bike parking, and more pedestrian amenities to get people downtown so they don't have to drive their car. So we need to think of that as a multifaceted approach where we address both supply and demand with regards to parking.
All right, Lisa Kempner. When we talk about ideal building height of the width of the street, what would that be for 12 Mile?
God, I feel like my answer is going to be the same as my answer was for the issue of buffering. It frankly depends on what we do with this issue of parking and lot depth. The deeper the building, the deeper the lot, or the bigger the lot, the more ability you have to either add height and or add more transition in terms of step back height along the corridor. If you don't address that issue, you address parking, just because of the limitations of development and the requirement to put in parking, you're not going to get anything. You're going to have trouble getting a second story, and you're definitely not going to get a third story on any of these streets, just because it's just not the area to put in the second story or third story and put in the required parking. However, if you're able to either rethink some of those parking issues and or add more parcel depth or width to it, then you could talk about doing increased height and potentially intensity. And I want to be very, very open and honest, is that 2 stories would be appropriate on 12 Mile. 3 stories, depending on the location and what's adjacent to it, may be questionable. Anything higher than that, I don't really see it, just based on both the existing road width and the existing conditions of the single family around it. But I think a second, potentially third story could be a viable kind of transition and a viable intensity along the corridor. Would you agree with that, Megan? Or
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things you need to keep in mind is what's the current width of the street, and then what's the planned width of the street. We got some information back from the road commission that actually the planned width of the street for 12 Mile is bigger than what it actually is. Now, whether that happens or not, in terms of whether that happens or not, is a completely different question. But also in terms of that road width to height ratio, it's really important then what's on the street. So in addition to getting that height right, which I agree with you, Ben, and 12 Mile as it is right now is probably 2 stories, ideally probably 3 stories max, but it still feels comfortable with 1 story, unless there's other things there, like sidewalks that are easily navigated by walkers, scooters, wheelchairs, the buffering elements that Ben pointed out, which were street trees and on-street parking, or maybe a bike lane to buffer you as the pedestrian from the traffic, and then how the area looks, and then also sometimes with urban design, there's things about windows. The picture that Ben showed of 12 Mile that seemed very automobile oriented, you'll notice there weren't that many windows in those buildings as well. So in the areas where you want to encourage people to walk all the time and feel comfortable, those are often, we've worked with communities that have required a certain percentage of windows to be part of any new build or renovation. And those are part of the things that make you as a human being feel comfortable and safe as you're walking around.
yeah, I just think about that question a little more, Lisa. I mean, think back to that picture, the first picture I showed of 12 Mile with the limited sidewalk and the road right there. Now, put a second or third story on that, how much more uncomfortable it would feel walking in that area than it would before, because there's just no sense of safety there. So it's very contextual. I mean, the height is very contextual with the surrounding area and what we do with those strategies that I mentioned earlier. But I'd ask you, Lisa, what do you think would be an appropriate height or scale on 12 Mile?
And Lisa, you can type your answer, but I will also allow you to talk if you'd like.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, hi.
Okay. Hi. I mean, I would probably agree. I think 2 stories, 3 does seem to be, at least in the current setup, seems to be like it would be a little overwhelming or kind of caving in. And as far as like the road count or the road commission, I think from what I've heard, they're frowning upon doing a whole lot with the street as far as pedestrian crossings or road diets or anything like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, so, and this is not to dump on the road commission, but I will for a second. Their job is to get cars as quickly as possible from point A to point B on their roads. They sometimes have trouble thinking for other transportation issues. So I think though what we could do is, if we prove that there's a strong community desire for this type of element, especially on 12 Mile, that's something the road commissioner would respond to. But it has to be that, for them to implement it, it has to be part of a planning effort, and it has to show strong community effort and strong community commitment to do it.
Yeah, and also in working with road commissions, if you plan ahead and have those plans ready for when they do their standard maintenance, or when they're going to do a project, if you can build those 2 together, again, it's sometimes it's much more palatable, and it'll bump up the list. Because they're also working in a constrained resource environment as well.
And this issue of road diets are really interesting because look at Coolidge as an example. You can do it as a pilot where you're not making, you're really just restriping lanes. You're not making a significant investment with infrastructure requirements. So if this is something the community desires, you can do it. You can do a test pilot on 12 Mile, just as you're doing on Coolidge, and do it as a pilot program and see how it works.
Anything else, Lisa? All right. Well, thank you. Oh.
So, Megan,
Yes.
Do you think it's obviously Berkley shares a lot of the corridors are actually adjacent municipalities, 11 Mile, Woodward, Greenfield. Do you think it's easier to plan for the corridors that are entirely within the boundaries of Berkley, or do you think that that's really not much of an issue if they're adjacent to another community?
I think in some ways it's easier to plan for the not necessarily to plan for, but to implement, is the corridor is in your entire community. So 12 Mile and Coolidge are definitely places where the city has control over both sides of the street. But on Woodward, 11 Mile, and Greenfield, those what's going on the other side of the street is a different municipality, and so that requires coordination. So they can be planned, and so one of our commitments to you as a community is to go to those adjacent communities and see what their plans are for those corridors and trying to implement and trying to coordinate as much as possible where it jives with the community values of Berkley. But at the same time, the implementation becomes much harder unless there's a joint plan. There's an organization such as Woodward Action Association who's actively coordinating and implementing those groups. And then looking to see, what's going on in each area. Also, you've got some challenges in terms of Woodward's a really, really big street. It moves a lot of traffic, but it's quite wide. When we're talking about that enclosure work, actually, if that looks more like someplace like Big Beaver and Troy, correct, Ben, in terms of the width. Mm-hmm. And that can be planned for a great urban design. And that can be implemented, but it takes a lot of coordination. And again, with somebody on the other side, and it's a long-term process. So I wouldn't say you should shy away from planning it, but you should know that the implementation is just going to be tougher because it requires coordination and communication with your neighbors.
Yeah, I mean the good thing is that if the other community shares a common goal with you in terms of corridor redevelopment, it's a lot easier to actually get things done in some respects because you've got now two municipalities pushing either the road commission, pushing MDOT, whoever it may be, and potentially two funding sources too. So in some respects, if you can coordinate your plans with the adjacent municipalities, it's easier to make some of those road improvements than it would be if you tackled it on your own, because MDOT and road commissions like it when communities work together. It's a lot easier for them than when they're in disagreement on issues. So it's a two-edged sword sometimes with shared boundaries of adjacent communities. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested from the attendees. What do you have? Do you have any thoughts on those bigger strategies I talked about the parcel issues or traffic calming on any of the corridors? Not just focus on 12 Mile, but any of the corridors. Is there any thought on that? Joe, I know you've got a thought.
All right.
Just got his hand raised.
I will. Joe, you should be allowed to talk. Hi, Joe. Your mic's open.
Joe, can you hear us?
Okay, Joe says he doesn't think his mic is working. All right. Okay. Well, then, Joe, type into the chat any of your thoughts. Chris C said, I think traffic calming is necessary on those if we desire a strong walkable corridor.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. there's a direct correlation between traffic speed and volume versus pedestrian improvements and feeling of safety. And so that's to the point where I talk about this balance. This community discussion. There's no magic bullet. You got to give up something to get something else in some respect. So there is a lot of truth to what you're saying. And I think, I don't know. I'll just throw it out. The Coolidge Road Diet. Well, I know there's been some pushback with regards to it. I think most people would feel that it's at least a safer, more enjoyable pedestrian and potentially biking road than what it was before the road diet. I would think most people would agree with that. So yeah, there's trade-off. There's significant trade-off.
And Lisa Kempner shared, parcel depth would also take multiple years to accomplish, wouldn't it? We have single-family housing property that's been rezoned to parking decades ago, but not all have changed hands.
Lisa, it could take decades. It also could happen very, very quickly. We've had experience doing this in other communities, and it really is a function of the market. If the market's strong, then people will purchase and buy up property to redevelop. If there is zoning in place that encourages or allows for some redevelopment, then it could happen quicker. But yes, it could take years. It could take many years to actually see significant changes, but it's really going to be a function of the market response and the strength of the market. But what the master plan does is this is something the community would desire or would want to achieve. You lay the groundwork in the master plan, and then you work on zoning to actually implement those potential changes. But you can't address the issue of zoning in the market until you at least lay out the foundation in your master plan. So that's the kind of conversation we're trying to have. Is this something that that you think we should explore? How do we approach it? What's the right methods to get some feedback on it?
Thanks, Lisa. We have two comments from Joe. One, I think traffic calming is a good idea for 12 Mile. And he also asked, how can the idea of quote unquote branding the corridors assist in community buy-in and traction for potential changes?
You want to tackle the branding?
Yeah. It goes back to kind of the, I don't know if you ever heard of the Main Streets model in terms of looking at corridors and how you market them. And, when that program was started, the main competition was the mall, right? And what the advantage of a mall, an enclosed mall like the Oakland Mall or Somerset has, is that they control the entire environment. And they can brand it as well and market it and market everything that's inside of it. And so that's where something like your DDA or other organizations come in, and they kind of act as the mall operator. And one of the things that they do is in terms of brand the corridor and market the corridor. The other thing that comes into that is programming and events. How do you get people there and to discover the new places? And then also finally, in terms of really making sure it's clean, safe, and inviting to be at. And so those are all the things that kind of come into those that come into that branding or marketing. And marketing is really about the product, price, place, and promotion. And so those take a lot of work. And often it's not something that the city has the bandwidth to do for every corridor. So one of the things that you can be done in the master plan is to identify which of the places that are different and have different needs along these corridors. Because clearly, as we talked about, Greenfield is a lot different than 12 Miles, a lot different than Woodward. And what should those land uses be planned for? What should the streetscape be for? But also, who are the partners who can do that other branding style? And then also, those are the people who are looking to recruit different folks to take over vacant storefronts, who are working with your merchants every day to say, what do you need? How can we help? And especially coming out of where we are today, that's going to be a constant challenge for at least the 6 months to the next year.
The only comment I'll make on the branding, and Megan and I are not marketing branding experts by any means. I don't think it's as simple as saying, 12 Mile is now branded whatever term you want to brand it, without implementing the other changes that we talked about, the streetscape potentially, the road diet, or potentially the redevelopment opportunities. It's not enough simply just to call it something and they will come. The branding has to be in partnership with other improvements on the corridor as well.
And we got a question from Chris C. Are there stats out there on how traffic calming discourages home invasions or theft in communities? I would imagine that being an effect with the reduction of speed for opportunists trying to get in and out of community near those corridors.
Yeah, there is an actual field of study in this, and I forgot what it's called, but where it measures physical community design versus policing, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so there's a lot of information on that. And so, yeah, I think if you talk to again, I'm not a public safety expert myself either, but if you talk to the police or whomever, they would say, slower speed would potentially decrease opportunities, for criminals and whatever mean. But again, I don't want to say that without actually having studied it. So, but I think there is a theory and there is some study out there that kind of addresses that issue.
Right, and in terms of it's slowing down, what it does is it assists in people being able to identify cars and know who's coming in and out of their community.
I had the other thought about that is I guess the answer is yes, Chris, because one of the things you always hear is more eyes on the road. So the more people you have out, the more people around, people walking, biking, etc. That's more eyes on the road, and it's less appealing for crime if there's a lot of people around, and there's a lot more eyes on the road. So anything you can do by reducing speed, the theory is by reducing speeds, you're increasing the ability for pedestrians and bicyclists, so they get out more. There'll be more people on the road. So yes, it could. In theory, it would reduce potential crime issues.
All right. Well, we are at 11:52. Do we have any last questions or comments, especially from those who have joined us? So Ben, is there a final question you want to go out on?
No, we're kind of laying out the foundation today. I'm very interested in what the community's thoughts on this. So I would encourage anyone that's got additional thoughts or comments on this to really feel free to get that into us. I know Joe and Lisa are on the steering committee, and so we will be talking about this with the steering committee. And I know Mr. Gavin obviously will have a role in this moving forward as well. And Chris, please feel free to email additional or comments or thoughts or whatever to us for our consideration. But yeah, I think this is again an interesting and important community conversation that we need to have. And I think that we're all realistic that, again, there's no magic bullet here. There is give and take to all of this. But we want to at least have that conversation and get that conversation started. So that's, I guess, my closing thoughts, Megan, unless you had something else.
I think that's excellent, Ben. Thanks so much. Tori, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended within the webinar, as well as everyone who is watching via our live stream. I love seeing those numbers continuously go up. But we will see you guys at the next webinar, which is happening next week. Excuse me for not knowing the date right off the top of my head.
I think it's June 26th at 6 p.m.
Yeah, June 24th at 6 p.m. We'll be discussing housing, which will be another fun topic to hear from the community on. So we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.